You're listening to This Week in E-Commerce, the Ecom Nation podcast. Dive into the top online retail headlines with your hosts, Paul Waddy and Mal Chia. Let's load up the cart. This Week in E-Commerce, it's Mal here with a special bonus episode. Due to scheduling conflicts, Paul and I couldn't record at the regular time, so we're going to be releasing episode 67 a little bit later this week. But what I did want to make sure I did was still release an episode this morning. And what I want to talk to you today is about words which really shit me in e-commerce. And the word which I want to talk to you about today is scaling. Now, scaling is a word which I was only really introduced to this about 5 or 7 years ago when I met a media trader who was telling me all they were trying to do was scale. All they wanted to do was be able to scale their Facebook ads. And I was like, what are you talking about? And when they explained what they were saying is that they wanted to be able to scale their spend from $10,000 to $50,000. And the belief which they had was that if I continue to scale my spend at that amount and my ROAS stays the same, I'm going to be able to 5x my business. And this then became something which I heard time and time again, the more I spoke to other people in the industry and what they were trying to do to grow their business. All they could talk about was how to scale. But scaling is actually the wrong word you should be using, because when you look at what scaling actually means, scaling means something completely different to what a lot of people think it means. Now, the concept of scaling has been around for a very long time. This is something which really stems back to the era of operational efficiency and unit economics and the manufacturing days. Now, you've probably heard of the term economies of scale. And what economies of scale mean is that your output increases as your costs decrease, or it stays the same as your costs decrease. So per unit, you're actually able to produce more or make more while your unit economics, i.e. how much you're paying to sell that unit, continues to decrease. So that's really where unit economics come into this and where the concept of scale and economies of scale come from. But since then, it's actually been completely, bastardized. And this really came about during the Silicon Valley days, particularly during the early days of companies like Facebook, Reddit, Uber, where I come from, Yelp, and a bunch of those early days Silicon Valley startups who were growing like crazy, particularly once they acquired VC money. When they had really good early growth, they would typically get to a point where a VC fund, a venture capital fund, would go to them and say, we really want to accelerate your growth. We think you've got a really great business model. Here's a stack of cash, and we want you to now grow like crazy. So what they would then do is what is termed blitzscaling, where they would do all these tactics, whether it be ads, whether it be CRO, whether it be offers or referrals, in an effort to be able to grow as quickly as possible, in the belief that the bigger you get, the faster you'll get to profitability. So that was back in the days where you were happy to actually accept a massive cash burn for years and years and years, until a point where you were so big that you became profitable. And you look at a company like Uber, for instance, which at its heyday was worth $70 or $80 billion, but is yet to actually turn a profit. Because what Uber did in the early days, and I was there, was to blitzscale, was to engage in lots of tactics which cost a lot of money in an effort to acquire lots of customers in order to grow so that we can be profitable. Similarly, companies like Klaviyo, for instance, and Shopify are similar in that they are rapidly trying to grow and acquire a large part of the market so that they can then become profitable down the track. At some point, though, this happened to trickle down to smaller businesses, or in those of you listening today, e-commerce businesses. It trickled down and it became something which we then started to talk about to scale, that we wanted to scale really quickly, because the early players in the e-commerce game could see the gold rush, could see the fact that with little competition out there and with the way the advertising platforms and the algorithms could work, they could acquire a lot of customers very quickly. So the perception was that I could just keep pumping more and more money into this, and lo and behold, I'm making more and more. But as we all know, with the changes in iOS, what's happened is that those algorithms don't work nearly as well as they used to. But not just that, post-COVID, there's now more competition out there than there ever has been before. So suddenly that concept of scaling, of this slot machine where you could put in $1 and get $5 out over and over and over again, no longer exists. But yet we persist in talking about scaling, and that everyone wants to be able to scale their ad spend, scale their Facebook account, scale their Google account in order to drive growth. But what's actually happening now is that you're not actually seeing that linear growth. Most times when people talk about scaling and by sheerly about spending more on your ads, you're not actually seeing any of that linear growth coming through, which means that you're not actually seeing any true scale. That, matter of fact, your unit economics are getting worse in time. And that's where metrics like marketing efficiency ratio become really important, because they can measure that if your MER percentage is going higher and higher, it means that you're not scaling. Because as you spend more, it doesn't actually mean you're getting more in return. And that's really the difference between, are you growing or are you scaling? Some businesses are happy to accept the fact that they're not getting that linear growth with their spend and they're not really truly scaling. And in some cases, it's actually going backwards, and that's okay. But a lot of businesses don't understand that, and they keep pumping more and more money into their ads, thinking that what they're doing is scaling. But what in fact they're doing is making their business less profitable. And unfortunately, one of the worst places to look at to accurately decide if you're going to scale or not is actually in the ad platforms themselves. Because it's very easy to make changes to your Facebook ads or your Google ads and spend more and more money and see your ROAS, or your conversion value divided by cost, remain the same, but your revenue actually either remain the same or decrease while your spend increases. And that's often what we see. That theory about just aggressively increasing spend rarely actually works in practice. That while I will be able to get an account to a certain point of scale, it will reach a point where it will no longer be able to continue to scale or grow, in fact. And your returns, well, actually, you won't get any returns from that. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that if you keep pursuing and keep investing and pumping money into the same bucket of customers and the same advertising campaigns which you're currently doing, you're naturally going to reach a point of saturation and a point of diminishing returns, because the audience pool who you're targeting with a certain campaign becomes saturated, particularly if you're just trying to acquire them at the same dollar value, but not really doing anything else to be able to feed into that bucket. And over time, you'll start to see that your click-through rates will get worse, your CPMs and your CPCs will continue to get worse as well, especially if you're not doing anything to top up that bucket and bring in more new customers into it who are higher up the funnel, who may not be ready to buy yet, which is something which I'm super passionate about. Then there's also the fact that sometimes you end up spending so much that you end up just cannibalizing your organic sales. In other words, sales which you would have already got had you not spent an additional dollar. And that's where things like when you look at branded search campaigns sometimes can be a bit of a misnomer, and you do need to exclude them from your analysis because they're people who likely would have bought already. Now, there's a point where it will go into people where you're just protecting your brand, but there's also a point where you're not actually adding any incremental value by doing that, which is why it's really important to make sure you're testing that. And there's that word incremental, which I'm going to talk to you about in very shortly as well. Because the other thing about scaling, as we talked about before, is that your unit economics are getting worse over time, which has cash flow implications. That while you may be selling more and more product, you can see that as a percentage, your free cash flow starts to decrease, which means that your working capital gets tighter and tighter and tighter, which also then leads to potential hidden costs, such as increased returns, increased customer service, increased postage costs, increased warehousing and staffing. So you need to consider all this about, is scaling or trying to grow at all costs the best thing for your business? So what I want you to think about instead, though, is instead of using the word scaling, use the word incrementality. Because what we're looking for here is incrementality is what we're doing, the activity which we're doing, actually leading to incremental revenue for whatever my spend is. And from a profitability standpoint, that is the only metric that matters. Not how much you can scale your ROAS or how much you can scale your spend, but whether the incrementality you're driving is proportional or not. Meaning that if I put $1 in, does it continue to increase at the same rate, or does it decrease or increase? Or is it higher or lower than that? Then in order to then think about incrementality, it then changed your mindset that rather than just driving increased spend and hoping that you get the same return out of it, it actually opens your mind up to trying more things about what is going to drive incremental value rather than just spending more money. And this is where you can start doing things like testing different creative, doing holdout groups, testing different markets, testing different audiences, just to see whether anything like that will drive incremental value and then drive greater efficiency. And that's why incrementality, and in relation to that, MER, becomes super, super important as a measure for, is my effort actually leading to incremental return? So if you say that I'm great at an MER of 15% and I keep pumping in more and more money and my MER stays the same, it means you've got perfect incrementality. But if I pump in more money and my MER goes up to 18, okay, I've got incrementality, but it hasn't been perfect. So what do I do then? Am I still happy at 18? Or can I then look to make that MER more efficient and do some of that testing creative, testing audiences, to be able to then bring that back down to that 15% where I'm happy? Because there always needs to be a bit of a push and pull. You need to be doing things to keep pushing your marketing harder, to try to get it to work harder for you. You can't just stay passively and just stay still. If you really want to grow, you need to be trying to push things harder, but always looking to push and pull. What can I do to push revenue? And then what can I do to pull back efficiency? Push revenue, pull back efficiency. So in closing, what I want to ask you to do is make sure that when you're looking at your advertising setup, if you're working with agency or whether you're doing it in-house, really asking, what am I actually trying to achieve? If the only lever you have is we need to spend more to make more, then you need to ask yourself, do we actually even have the right strategy in place? Are we actually thinking about how are we growing each different audience from awareness to consideration to conversion and retention? Because if you don't have that strategy in place and all you're doing is pumping more and more money into it, you can be guaranteed you're going to hit a ceiling eventually and you are going to start seeing your profitability decline rapidly. All right, that's all I got time for this week. Paul and I will be recording very, very shortly, which means that you're going to be getting episode 67 as well as this bonus episode. I hope you enjoy it. Love to hear what you think. Leave me a note in the comments. Otherwise, hit me up on LinkedIn. Would love to hear what you guys think. Also, if there's any other buzzwords which you would love me to deep dive into at another stage. Have a good one.